I remember the exact moment I decided to surprise her. It was a Tuesday, which sounds like a perfectly ordinary detail, but I have come to understand that the most important moments of a person's life almost always begin on ordinary days, in ordinary moments, when you are standing in your kitchen in your socks, pouring a second cup of coffee that has already gone cold, and thinking that today, for once, you will do something spontaneous. Her name is Claire, my wife. Claire Ellison, though professionally she goes by Claire Harmon, the name she had before we married, because she built her reputation under that name, and it would have been foolish to change it once she became someone. And she did become someone, that is the truth of it. Claire became one of those rare people who do not merely climb ladders, but build entirely new buildings and then install their own elevators. She had started Harmon Strategic Solutions from a spare bedroom in our first apartment, the one that smelled like the Thai restaurant below us, and had a radiator that clanged every night at 2 in the morning like it was trying to escape. That was 17 years ago. Now, her company occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, employed over 300 people, and had been featured on the cover of 2 national business magazines in the past year alone. I was proud of her. I want to make sure I say that clearly, because what comes later might make you doubt it. I was genuinely, deeply proud of her. I'm a high school history teacher. I coach junior varsity soccer in the fall. I grade papers at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, and I think about the Battle of Antietam more often than any well-adjusted person probably should. I did not marry Claire because I wanted to ride alongside her ambitions. I married her because she laughed at my terrible jokes, and she cried at the end of old movies. And she made me feel, more than anyone else I had ever known, that being ordinary was not the same as being small. But I want to be honest with you, because this story demands honesty. There were things I had been trying not to think about, small things, each of them individually dismissible, the kind you file away in that drawer in the back of your mind where you keep everything you are not quite ready to examine. The late nights had always been there, but in the past 8 months or so, they had become more frequent. Not dramatically so, not in any way I could point to and say, there, that is the moment it changed. But I am a history teacher, and I know better than most that change rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly, and then one day you look up, and the landscape is completely different from the one you thought you were standing in. There were other things too. She had started taking some of her calls in the bedroom with the door closed, which she said was because she needed quiet, and I believed her, because what else would I do? She had a new perfume, something darker and more expensive than what she usually wore, and when I mentioned I liked it, she looked at me for just a fraction of a second too long before she said, "Thank you." She had lost weight, not a worrying amount, but enough that her old blazers fit differently. She had started going to the gym before work, which she attributed to her doctor telling her she needed to manage her stress levels. All of this was explainable. All of it had an answer, but explanations and answers are not always the same thing, and somewhere below the level of conscious thought, I had been keeping a list. None of that was in my mind on that Tuesday morning, or maybe it was in some buried way, and the decision to surprise her was not as spontaneous as I told myself it was. I've thought about that a great deal since. I made her favorite, a chicken salad with the dried cranberries and the candied walnuts she liked, and I packed it in the small insulated bag we used for picnics. I thought I would bring her lunch. I thought we would sit together in her office for 20 minutes, eat, talk, maybe remember for a little while that we were still people to each other and not just 2 adults sharing a house and a mortgage and a calendar full of obligations. I thought it would be a good thing. A husband thing. The Harmon Strategic Building was about 40 minutes from our house in light traffic. I drove with the windows down because March had arrived warm that year, unseasonably so, and the city smelled like it was trying to convince you spring had already come. I parked in the visitor lot across the street and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking up at the building. I had been there before, of course. I had attended the ribbon cutting when they first moved in, 4 years ago, and I had come to a holiday party in December 2 years back, but I had not been inside since then. Claire always said it was easier to just meet at home, and I had agreed because it seemed like a reasonable thing to say, and I am, by nature, a person who finds reasonable things agreeable. The lobby was all marble and glass and the kind of expensive silence that only exists in buildings where a great deal of money is being made. There was a long security desk near the entrance, the kind with a curved front and a bank of monitors behind it, and 2 guards stationed there, one a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray mustache, and the other a younger woman reading something on a tablet. There was a set of glass turnstiles leading to the elevators, and beside the main entrance there was a brass-framed sign that read, in clean capital letters, "Authorized personnel only beyond this point. Please check in with security." I walked to the desk and set down the lunch bag and smiled at the older guard, whose name tag read, Dennis. I said, "Hi there, I'm here to see Claire Harmon. She's the CEO. I'm her husband. I'm just dropping off her lunch." Dennis looked up at me. He had one of those faces that has spent a long time in a state of professional neutrality, the kind of face that has seen everything and reacts to nothing, the face of a man who has worked security desks for decades and is no longer surprised by any variety of human being who walks through a door. And yet something shifted when I said those words. Something behind his eyes moved. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but I am a person who pays attention to faces. I teach teenagers for a living. You learn to read the micro-expressions, the tiny fractures in the surface of what someone is presenting to you. He looked at me, and then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was more like the laugh of a man who has been caught off guard and whose body has reacted before his professionalism could stop it. He caught himself almost immediately, pressed his lips together, and cleared his throat. He said, "I'm sorry, sir. I apologize. It's just... the thing is..." He paused. He glanced at the younger guard who had looked up from her tablet. "Sir, I see your husband every day. He just left the building about 20 minutes ago." The lunch bag was still in my hand. I remember that detail with strange clarity. The handle of it, the way the nylon felt against my palm. I stood there, and I looked at Dennis, and I felt the world do something underneath me. Not quite a shift, more like a very slight vibration, the kind you feel sometimes when a large truck passes on a street below you and you are on an upper floor, and everything solid seems for just a moment less solid than it was. I said, "I'm sorry?" Dennis straightened. He was recalibrating. I could see it. He said, "Sir, are you sure you have the right building?" "This is Harmon Strategic Solutions." I said, "Yes, I know. I've been here before. My wife is Claire Harmon. We've been married for 14 years. There was a pause. The young guard had put her tablet all the way down now. Dennis looked at me with an expression that had become carefully, deliberately blank, which told me more than any expression would have. He said, "Sir, I think there may be some confusion. Why don't you give me a moment? I'll need to make a call." And there it was. The option to make a scene, to insist, to demand, to say, "No, there is no confusion. I am who I say I am. Get Claire Harmon on the phone right now, and we will sort this out in 30 seconds. That was the obvious thing, the reasonable thing, the thing any person in their right mind would do when confronted with something this absurd. I did not do it. I don't know exactly why I didn't, even now. Perhaps it was a kind of instinctive cowardice, a need to delay the moment of knowing. Perhaps it was something older and more calculated, some part of me that understood that if I made noise, whoever was in that building would be warned, that the information would be sanitized before I could see it raw. I was a history teacher, and history had taught me that the most valuable intelligence is gathered quietly before the subject knows they are being watched. I smiled. I said, "You know what? I think you're right. I may have gotten confused with her old building. I'm sorry to bother you." Dennis looked relieved in a way that told me he had been worried about how this was going to go. He said, "No trouble at all, sir. You have a good day now." I picked up the lunch bag, and I walked back out through the glass doors, and I stood on the sidewalk, and the city continued around me as if nothing had happened, as if the ground had not just opened up and shown me a darkness I had no map for. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked to the coffee shop across the street, the one with the wide windows that looked directly at the entrance of the building, and I sat down at a table near the glass, and I ordered a coffee I did not touch, and I waited. I want to tell you what I was thinking, But the truth is, I was not thinking in any ordered way. There was a kind of white noise in my brain, a static that happens when information arrives that your mind cannot immediately categorize. I kept replaying Dennis's laugh, that involuntary bark of disbelief. I see her husband every day. He just left the building. The certainty in it. Not confusion, not the look of a man who might be mistaken, the look of a man who knows exactly what he sees every day and was simply startled by an anomaly. I thought about the past 8 months. I thought about the perfume. I thought about the calls behind closed doors. I thought about a Saturday 3 months ago when Claire had come home from what she said was a morning of errands, and I had noticed, without registering it consciously at the time, that she was wearing earrings she had not left the house with. Small gold hoops I did not recognize. I had not said anything. I had looked at them and looked away and turned back to the eggs I was scrambling, and I had put the image in the drawer at the back of my mind along with all the other things I was not ready to look at. I sat in the coffee shop, and I looked at the entrance to her building, and I thought, who is he? I did not have to wait long. Or rather, I waited 40 minutes, which felt both endless and instantaneous, in the way that time distorts when you are in a state of high anxiety. And then a man came out of the building. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of effortless physical confidence that belongs to men who have never had any real reason to doubt themselves. He was perhaps 40, give or take a year, with dark hair that was starting to silver at the temples in a way that looked, frankly, distinguished. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him the way suits fit men in advertisements, not off a rack but constructed for that specific body. He had a leather portfolio under one arm, and he was on his phone, smiling at something someone was saying. And even from across the street I could see that his smile was the kind that arrived easily and stayed comfortably, the smile of a man for whom the world has generally cooperated. He stopped on the sidewalk and finished his call and stood for a moment scrolling through something on his phone, and then he looked up and caught the eye of a car that had just pulled to the curb, a black sedan, and he moved toward it with that easy stride and got in and was gone. I sat there with my cold coffee and I thought, he works there, or he visits often enough that the security guard knows him as a daily fixture, and somehow at some point he had been introduced to the staff or had introduced himself as Claire's husband. The question was whether Claire knew he was doing that, and if she did, what that meant, and if she did not, what that meant instead. I paid for my coffee, and I drove home, and I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when you are alone in them during the day, a slightly weighted silence, the silence of rooms full of a life that is momentarily paused. I walked through the kitchen and the living room, and I looked at the photographs on the mantel, the one from our wedding, the one from the trip to Portugal 3 years ago, the one of us at my brother's 4th of July party last summer, our faces tanned and happy and entirely unaware. I thought, I need to know who he is. I am a history teacher, but before I decided to teach, I had spent 2 years in a graduate program for investigative journalism before I realized I did not have the stomach for it, for the intrusion that it required, for making yourself a necessary disruption in other people's lives. I still remembered how to find things, though. I still knew the basic architecture of information, where it lived and how to reach it without being noticed. That evening, Claire came home at 8:30, which was not unusual. She looked tired in the way she always looked tired, a particular kind of fatigue that she wore around her eyes and shoulders, but nowhere else, as if her body knew better than to let exhaustion reach her face. She kissed me on the cheek and asked what was for dinner, and I said I had made pasta, which I had because making dinner was something to do with my hands during the hours I had been home trying to think. We sat at the table and she told me about her day in the general terms she always used, the meeting with the board, the proposal from the Frankfurt office, the issue with the quarterly projections. I listened, and I watched her, and I looked for the thing that was hidden inside her ordinary face, and I could not find it. She was exactly as she always was. She was my wife, tired and smart and faintly distracted, eating pasta and talking about work, and occasionally glancing at her phone when it buzzed. I said, "How's the team doing? Anyone new on your floor lately?" She considered this without looking up from her plate. She said, "We brought on a consultant a few months ago, Marcus Webb. He's been working with us on the restructuring." "Why?" I said, Just curious. You've mentioned the restructuring a few times. I wondered who was handling it. She said, he's good. Very experienced. Comes from a private equity background. She said it the way you say things about colleagues, with a flat professionalism, the way I might mention the new vice principal at school. And yet, his name was Marcus Webb. She had said it without hesitation, without any flicker of calculation, which could mean she had nothing to hide, or could mean she had practiced being casual about it so many times that the casualness had become genuine. After dinner, I did the dishes, and she went upstairs to finish something on her laptop, and I stood at the sink with the water running, and I thought, Marcus Webb. Over the following 3 days, I learned a great deal about Marcus Webb. He was 43 years old. He had grown up in Connecticut, attended Dartmouth, and had an MBA from Wharton. He had worked for 2 private equity firms before striking out on his own as an independent restructuring consultant, which was a polite way of saying he was the man companies hired when they needed to cut costs and absorb the bad feelings that came with it. His LinkedIn profile showed a face that confirmed my identification from across the street, the dark hair, the silvering temples, the easy smile, the suit. He had 300 connections on LinkedIn, and they were all exactly the kind of people you would expect: finance directors and managing partners and executive VPs with titles that sounded important and vague in equal measure. He was not married, at least not currently, and there was no record that I could find of a former marriage. He had no children that appeared anywhere in his public footprint. He had a condo in the city and a house in the Berkshires that appeared in county records in his name alone. He was, by every available measure, a successful, solitary, and entirely plausible man. What I could not determine from public records was the nature of his relationship with my wife. I could see that Harman Strategic had engaged his firm, Webb Consulting Group, for what appeared to be an ongoing retainer, and I found a mention of him in a Business Journal article about the company from 6 months ago, describing him as a key architect of their current growth strategy. He was quoted twice in the article. Claire was quoted 4 times. Their quotes did not address each other directly. This told me nothing. On the 4th day, I went back to the coffee shop across from her building. I had given myself a reason to be in that part of the city, a dentist appointment that I had rescheduled to a different day but told no one had been rescheduled. This is the kind of small logistical lie that a person who suspects something begins to construct almost automatically, the infrastructure of suspicion, the cover stories you build not because you are duplicitous by nature, but because you are trying to protect yourself enough to see clearly. I sat in the coffee shop for 3 hours. I watched the entrance of the building. I was on my 2nd coffee and had eaten a croissant I had not wanted, and was beginning to feel the specific despair of a person who is committed to a course of action that may not yield anything, when I saw them. They came out together, Claire and Marcus Webb. They were standing close but not touching, walking in the easy, synchronized way of people who have spent a great deal of time moving through spaces together, that unconscious physical calibration that develops between people who are comfortable in each other's proximity. Claire was talking, and Marcus was listening with his whole body tilted fractionally toward her, his expression attentive and warm. She said something, and he laughed, and she smiled at his laugh in the particular way you smile when someone's laughter is familiar and pleasing to you. They stopped on the sidewalk. They talked for a few more minutes. Then the black sedan appeared again, and Marcus said something to Claire, and Claire nodded and said something back, and Marcus touched her arm. Just her arm. A brief light contact on the sleeve of her coat, above the elbow. The kind of touch that exists in the narrow territory between collegial and intimate. Then he got in the car, and she went back inside, and I sat with my 3rd coffee, and I felt the static in my brain resolving into something colder and more specific. I drove to the school because I had afternoon classes, and I taught 2 periods of American history and 1 period of AP government, and I stood in front of rooms full of 17-year-olds and talked about the Missouri Compromise and the evolution of the Senate filibuster. And the whole time, there was a part of my mind running a separate conversation with itself, quiet and persistent, going over everything I had seen and everything I had not yet found. That evening, I said nothing to Claire. We watched television after dinner, something she had chosen, one of those documentary series about architecture, and she fell asleep on the couch 40 minutes in the way she sometimes did when she was genuinely exhausted, and I sat beside her and watched her sleep and tried to reconcile the woman in front of me with the possibility I was assembling. The next morning, I called Dennis. I had gotten the name of the building's management company from their website and worked my way through to the security contractor, and after 2 transfers and some patience, I got a person in the contractor's administrative office who was willing to tell me that the head of security at the Harmon building was a man named Dennis Carver. I called the building directly and asked for Dennis Carver at the security desk. He picked up on the second ring. I did not tell him who I was. I said I was a journalist working on a profile of Claire Harmon for a business publication, which was the sort of lie that I would have been uncomfortable with in any other context, and which now felt not only acceptable but necessary. And I asked if he could confirm some basic details about daily operations at the building, very general, nothing sensitive. Dennis was friendly in the way that people who work at security desks are friendly when they believe you are who you say you are, which is a warmth kept carefully on the surface with a great deal of institutional caution underneath it. I asked, in the most casual possible way, whether he could tell me anything about the regular visitors to the executive floor, just for color, for the sense of the professional environment around Ms. Harmon. Dennis said the executive floor was very busy, lots of foot traffic, consultants, board members, clients. I said, I understand there's a restructuring consultant, Marcus Webb, who's been a regular presence. Dennis said yes, Marcus was in most days, sometimes twice a day. I said, he seems to have made himself comfortable in the building. I heard someone mention he's almost like a member of the family. Dennis laughed, and it was the same laugh I had heard in the lobby a week before, the same involuntary quality to it. He said, well, that's one way to put it. I waited. Dennis said, look, off the record, Marcus is, well, he's introduced himself as Ms. Harmon's husband to a few of the newer staff. I don't know the whole story there. It's not my place to say. I said, when did that start? Dennis paused. He was deciding how much to say. He said, maybe 5, 6 months ago. He shows up, signs in as a personal guest of Ms. Harmon, everything above board. But somewhere along the way, he started introducing himself differently to people in the building. Some of the newer staff just assumed, I know what I see on the sign-in logs, but it's not my business to correct what people say about themselves in the hallways. I thanked him and ended the call and sat in my car in the school parking lot for a long time. 5 or 6 months ago was around the time the late nights had started increasing, around the time of the new perfume, around the time she had started closing the bedroom door for phone calls. Here is the thing about a realization that you have been partially building for a long time. It does not arrive like a lightning bolt. It arrives like a tide. It has been rising for weeks, months, quietly filling the space around you, and then at some point you notice that you are standing in water up to your waist, and you have no memory of getting wet. I was standing in water, but I still did not have the whole story. And something was nagging at me, a detail that did not fit neatly into the picture I was assembling. If this was the obvious thing, if Marcus Webb was simply a man conducting an affair with my wife, and had, out of some combination of arrogance and wishful thinking, started presenting himself as her husband to the people around her, then what was Dennis's reaction when I had walked in? It had been surprised, yes, startled, but it had also been something else, something that I could not quite name, that had seemed less like the reaction of a man confronted with a betrayed husband, and more like the reaction of a man confronted with something he genuinely did not understand. 2 husbands. That was the thing Dennis had been processing. Not one husband and one lover. 2 people, each of whom had some claim to the word husband. Unless. I sat with that thought, unless the situation was not what I thought it was. I went home and I went to the filing cabinet in the study, the one where we kept the important documents, the mortgage papers and the insurance policies and the tax returns and the wills. I went through it methodically, folder by folder, and everything was there, everything I expected, until I reached the back section where we kept the older papers, the things you never look at but cannot bring yourself to throw away, and I found something that I had not put there and did not recognize. It was an envelope from a law firm, Markwell and Rains Family Law. The postmark was 7 months ago. It had been opened. I took out the letter inside and I read it, and I read it again. And then I sat on the floor of the study with the letter in my hand, and I understood that the story I had been telling myself for the past week was wrong in a way I had not anticipated. The letter was not about an affair. It was about a divorce, or rather, it was about the beginning of a divorce. It was a preliminary communication from a family law attorney to my wife outlining the terms of an initial consultation regarding the dissolution of a marriage, and the name of the other party in that consultation was not mine. It was not my name. The other party was a man named Richard Harmon. Richard Harmon, her maiden name, Harmon. Not her professional identity, but her family name, the name she had been born with, the name she had carried from Connecticut to a spare bedroom apartment to a glass tower in the financial district. Harmon. I sat on the floor of my study and I thought, she was married before. And I did not know. And then, following immediately and with extraordinary force, and neither did anyone at that building, because the name she used professionally, the name on the door of that company, was the same name as her first husband's last name, and everyone who worked for her assumed that the man named Harmon, who moved through those hallways with the ease and confidence of ownership, was her husband because the math seemed to add up and no one had thought to check the arithmetic. I am a history teacher. I know that the most consequential errors in human events are almost never the result of malice. They are the result of assumption, the map that everyone agrees on without anyone having verified the territory. I needed to find Richard Harmon. It took me 2 days. He was not difficult to find once I knew what I was looking for. He was 47 years old. He had grown up in Hartford, studied engineering, spent 15 years working for an infrastructure development firm. He and Claire Harmon had been married for 4 years, between the ages of 26 and 30, during the period when I had been in graduate school in a different city, and Claire and I had not yet met. The divorce had been finalized, according to the court records I accessed through a public record search 11 years ago, 2 years before Claire and I met, and 3 years before we married. Richard Harmon had kept the name, or rather he had never changed it, because it was his birth name and there was no reason to change it. He still lived in the metro area. He worked independently now, some kind of engineering consultancy. He had no social media presence to speak of, and Marcus Webb, I now understood, was not having an affair with my wife. Marcus Webb was, in all likelihood, conducting some kind of professional relationship with Richard Harmon and had either misidentified himself deliberately or had been introduced in some confusing way that had caused the staff at her building to draw the wrong conclusion. Or perhaps Marcus had some other relationship to the Harmon name that I had not yet mapped out. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, but not entirely. I called Richard Harmon on a Thursday morning. He answered on the third ring with a voice that was careful and measured, the voice of a man who had learned to be watchful about unknown calls. I said, "My name is David Ellison. I'm Claire Harmon's husband, her current husband, and I think we need to talk." There was a silence, and then he said, "I've been wondering when this call would come." We met that afternoon at a diner near his office, a place with red vinyl booths and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly ill. Richard Harmon was a lean man with rectangular glasses and a manner that reminded me of engineers I had known in college, precise and slightly awkward in the way of people who are most comfortable with systems that obey rules. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm and apologetic at the same time, which seemed about right for the situation. He said, "Before you say anything, I want you to know that what you probably think is happening is not what's happening." I said, "What I think is happening changes every 6 hours, so why don't you just tell me?" He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and he told me. 7 months ago, he had been contacted by a man named Marcus Webb on behalf of a private equity group that was assembling a silent stake in Harmon Strategic Solutions. The group wanted to acquire a controlling interest in the company without triggering the disclosure requirements that would come with approaching the board directly, because they believed the board would refuse the acquisition and move to block it. Their strategy involved building their stake gradually through a series of smaller purchases from individual shareholders, and the largest individual minority shareholder outside of Claire herself was Richard Harmon, who had retained equity from the original founding in their divorce settlement. Marcus Webb had been courting Richard for months, presenting the acquisition as beneficial, arguing that the company was undervalued and that a private equity takeover would unlock value that Claire's cautious management style was suppressing. Richard had been considering it. The terms were generous, more than generous, and Marcus Webb had been accessing the building, Richard told me, partly to manage the logistics of the acquisition preparation, and partly because someone, and Richard was not certain who, had told the building staff at some point that Marcus was representing the Harmon family's interests, which had been interpreted, in the loose and assumption-prone way of corporate corridors, as meaning Marcus was family. Richard had not corrected this impression because he had not known about it until recently, when one of Claire's assistants had mentioned to a mutual contact that Ms. Harmon's husband was often in the building, and the mutual contact had mentioned it to Richard, who had found it puzzling and troubling and had not yet decided what to do about it. And Marcus Webb, as it turned out, was representing both the private equity group and his own interests, because he had a 7% stake in the acquiring group and stood to benefit substantially if the acquisition went through. And Claire, Richard said quietly, did not know any of this. She did not know her company was being acquired from beneath her. She did not know that her ex-husband's equity was being used as the mechanism. She did not know that the restructuring consultant she had trusted with the internal architecture of her business had been, from the beginning, a Trojan horse. I sat in that red vinyl booth with my hands on the table, and I thought about my wife working late every night in a building where a man was quietly constructing the walls of a cage around everything she had built. I said, "Why are you telling me this?" Richard took his glasses off and cleaned them with the hem of his shirt in that way people do when they need a moment to organize themselves. He said, "Because I told Marcus no. 3 weeks ago, I told him I wasn't selling my stake. He did not take it well. And since then I've been trying to figure out the right way to tell Claire, and I haven't been able to do it, because she and I are not close, David. We ended things a long time ago, and it ended cleanly enough, but it did not end warmly. I don't know how to call her and say, 'Your restructuring consultant has been using access to your building and your strategic plans to engineer a hostile takeover,' and I almost participated." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I do. I drove to her building. I parked in the visitor lot, and I walked across the street, and I went through the glass doors, and Dennis looked up from his desk, and I watched his face go through several expressions in very quick succession, starting with recognition, moving through confusion, and arriving at something that looked very much like understanding. I said, "Dennis, I need you to call Claire Harmon and tell her that her actual husband is in the lobby and would like to come up." There was a pause. Dennis picked up the phone. I rode the elevator to the 38th floor, which was the top floor, Claire's floor. The doors opened to a reception area with a curved desk and a young woman behind it who told me, with practiced smoothness, that Ms. Harmon's assistant would be right with me. I stood and looked at the view through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out below in the afternoon light, all glass and stone and movement. The assistant appeared and led me down a corridor lined with glass-walled conference rooms, and I saw people in them, people in suits with laptops and coffee cups and the concentrated expressions of people solving problems, and I thought about how Claire had built all of this, from a spare bedroom and a clanging radiator and a dream she had never once expressed to me as doubt. The office at the end of the corridor had her name on the door. The assistant knocked and opened it, and I walked in. Claire was at her desk. She looked up from her screen, and she saw me, and her face did what it always did when she saw me unexpectedly. It softened, the professional armor coming off in that instant, the way it only does for people you have loved for a long time, the specific relaxation of being seen by someone who already knows you. And then she looked at my face, and she saw something there. And she sat back in her chair and said, "David, what's wrong?" I sat down across from her, in the chair across her desk, and I put the lunch bag on the desk between us because I had brought it with me, the same lunch I had made 8 days ago, replaced with fresh ingredients, the chicken salad with the dried cranberries and the candied walnuts, because I had never stopped meaning to bring it. I said, "First, I need you to know that I know I should have asked you about this directly instead of investigating on my own, and I'm sorry for that." She said, "You've been investigating something?" Her voice was careful. I said, "And second, I need you to know that none of what I found is what I thought it was going to be, and for a few days I thought some things about you that were wrong, and I want to acknowledge that." She said, "David?" I said, "And third, and this is the important part, someone is trying to take your company from you and you need to know about it right now." I told her everything. I told her about coming to the building with the lunch, about Dennis and his laugh, about the man I had seen leaving, about the coffee shop, about the files and the letter, about Richard and the diner and the red vinyl booths and the private equity group, and Marcus Webb, and the 7% stake, and the Trojan horse that had been walking through her building for 7 months wearing the borrowed authority of her family's name. She listened the way she always listened, which was completely, without interrupting, her face moving through the information in a way that was not emotional, exactly, but was not unemotional either. It was the face of someone thinking at full capacity, processing and assessing and cross-referencing in real time, the face of a person whose mind had been trained to take incoming data and immediately begin building a response to it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marcus Webb has access to every structural document we've produced in the last 8 months. He has the projections for the next 3 years. He has the client pipeline analysis." I said, "I know." She said, "He's been sharing that with a takeover group." I said, "Yes." She said, "And Richard told you this." I said, "Richard said no to them. He's not selling." She looked at the lunch bag on her desk. Then she looked at me, and something moved through her face that was not the controlled processing expression, something older and less managed. She said, "You thought I was having an affair." I said, "For about 4 days, yes." She said, "And then you found the letter from the attorney." I said, "Yes." She said, "I should have told you about Richard, about the first marriage. I've thought about telling you many times. I don't know why I never did. I think I was afraid it would complicate things that I needed to be uncomplicated." I said, "It would have been fine." She said, "I know." She said, "I know that now." I said, "It's still fine." She looked at me for a long time. Outside the windows, the city was doing what cities do in the late afternoon, the light changing from white to gold, the shadows lengthening, the whole enormous machine of it shifting into its evening configuration. She said, "You brought me lunch," I said. "Chicken salad, the one with the cranberries." She said, "I can't believe you brought me lunch while you thought I was having an affair." I said, "I made it before I knew." She said, "You kept making it anyway." I said, "It seemed like something worth finishing." She stood up from her desk and she walked around it, and she stood in front of me, and I stood up, and she put her arms around me, and I put mine around her, and we stood there in her office at the top of the building she had built. And I thought about all the things that do not announce themselves, all the quiet accumulated changes and the assumptions that harden into walls, and how sometimes it takes the right kind of disruption to see clearly again. She said, into my shoulder, "I have to fire Marcus." I said, "Yes, and probably call your lawyers." She said, "Richard saved my company." I said, "He said no to them." That's what he did. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'll have to call him." I said, "He seemed like he was hoping you would." She pulled back and looked at me, and her eyes were wet in the way that Claire's eyes get wet when she is trying very hard not to cry, which is to say they were bright and precise, and she blinked twice, and then she was fine. She picked up the lunch bag and opened it and looked inside, and she said, "You made the dressing from scratch?" I said, "Of course." She sat back down behind her desk and she opened the container and she took a fork from her desk drawer because she had a fork in her desk drawer, because she often ate at her desk, because this was who she was and had always been. And she ate, and we talked, properly talked, for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit. She told me she'd been distracted. Not by Marcus, not in the way I had feared, but by the pressure of the restructuring, by the weight of everything she was carrying, by a creeping sense of something not being right that she had not been able to name. She said she had noticed things in the internal reports that did not add up, small discrepancies, things that could be errors or could be something else, and she had not trusted her own judgment about them because she was tired, and because Marcus was convincing, and because when you are tired, you sometimes suspect yourself before you suspect the room. I thought about how I had done the same thing, how I had put things in the drawer instead of looking at them, had trusted the surface of things instead of the shape of what was underneath. We had both been moving through the same house, sleeping in the same bed, eating at the same table, and we had both been carrying private doubts we had not known how to name to each other. She called her head of legal while I sat there. She was direct and specific and completely controlled, the way she always was in professional crisis, and I watched her and thought about the spare bedroom and the clanging radiator and the 17 years that had produced this woman at this desk in this building making this call, and I felt something that was not quite pride and not quite love and not quite awe, but was made of all three of those things pressed together until they became something new. That evening, she dealt with Marcus Webb. I was not there for it. I had left by then. I had driven home and made dinner, but she told me about it later. He had denied everything at first, then attempted to reframe it. Then, when she laid out what she knew, he became formal and lawyerly and said he would be in touch through counsel. She had him escorted from the building by Dennis, which she said gave her more satisfaction than it probably should have. The private equity group was identified in the following weeks through the legal proceedings that followed. They had not yet acquired enough equity to trigger disclosure thresholds, and with Richard's stake held, they did not have a controlling interest and never had. The acquisition attempt collapsed. Two of the group's principals ended up the subject of a regulatory inquiry. Marcus Webb's consulting firm was dissolved 18 months later. Richard Harmon and Claire met for coffee in April, and Claire called me afterward to tell me it had been strange and not unpleasant, that Richard was a careful and decent man who had made a mistake and then corrected it, and that she was glad she had called. I went back to the lobby of her building on the 1st of May. Dennis was at the desk, and he looked up when I walked in, and this time his face did not do anything complicated. He reached under the desk and pulled out a visitor badge and slid it across the counter. He said, "She said to expect you." I said, "She told you I was coming?" He said, "She told me you're her husband, and that I should stop being confused about that." He smiled. He said, "She said it in a way that was pretty hard to argue with." I clipped the badge to my jacket and I walked through the turnstile, and I rode the elevator up to the 38th floor, and I brought her lunch again, and this time I did not have to pretend to be anyone other than who I was, a middle-aged history teacher with a chicken salad and a wife who had built something extraordinary while he was watching, not always closely enough, but still watching, still there, still hers and she still his, in all the ways that matter, in all the ways that time and habit and small failures and second chances have a way of making unbreakable. There is a thing about history that I try to teach my students, and it is this: the events that seem to define a moment are almost never the real story. The real story is in the conditions, the long, slow accumulation of pressures and assumptions and silences that made the moment inevitable. The event is just where the story becomes visible. Everything before that was the story too. I know my wife now in ways I did not know her before, not because the crisis revealed her exactly, but because it revealed me to myself, revealed the things I had been willing to not see, the comfortable blindness that is one of the great dangers of a long marriage, the way love can become a kind of fog if you are not careful, warm and soft and opaque. I had stopped looking at her the way you look at something you are still learning. I had started looking at her the way you look at something you already know. She is still busy. She still works late. She still takes calls behind closed doors sometimes, and I still sometimes notice the small things and put them in the drawer. But now I have a better habit, and the habit is that when the drawer gets too full, I say something. I open my mouth and I say her name and I say, "I've been thinking about something." And she puts down whatever she is doing, and she looks at me with those precise and serious eyes, and she listens, completely, the way she always has. That is who she is. That is who we are. It took me sitting in a coffee shop across the street from her building, drinking cold coffee and watching the entrance for a man whose name I did not yet know, to understand something I should have been able to see from my own kitchen. That the work of knowing someone is never finished. That you have to keep doing it, day after day. the same stubborn daily practice of attention. Or you will find yourself standing in someone's lobby being told something that makes no sense, when the truth is it makes perfect sense if you had only been paying closer attention all along. I was paying attention on the day it mattered. Maybe that is enough. Maybe that is what I will tell myself. Not that I was always watching, but that when the moment came, I did not look away.